good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to something in the region of 102 Reading online sport economics seminars. As I said last week, we had a gap in the seminars series this week and next week, and Thomas delightfully stepped in, and he's going to give us a talk for which I don't have the title to hand. So if you're ready to share your screen, I can then act like I really knew what the title was all along, Thomas. But either way, it's a talk on ice hockey. It's a very recent paper that from Thomas's Twitter, you'll know that you can find as a CEPR working paper. Oh, there you go. The impact of absent co-workers on the productivity of teams. It's work joint with Sam Hoey and Jan van Oors. And there's little reason for me to sit here and talk any longer other than to let Thomas take his talk away. So Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James, and thanks for the opportunity. It's a bit surprising to be presenting because, as you said, it was all decided in the last couple of days. This paper is also very, very recent, so we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it very much. It's a paper on ice hockey, and the title, as was said, is The Impact of Absent Co-workers on Productivity in Teams. And so the instigator of all of this is, of course, Sam Hoey, which you might or might not have met yet, but he's our PhD student, and he's half Canadian, half Dutch. So that's where this all comes from. Jan and me, we spent most of the research time on this project having explained ice hockey to us. So we'll see how far we got along with that. So what's the idea of this paper? The idea is basically to look at teamwork, and as this audience probably doesn't need to be convinced of this, but teamwork is pervasive in the economy, and I'm going to give you some examples of teamwork where it happens. Here are two airline pilots, for example. They need to work together in the cockpit. Here is a recent thing that I learned, that there's a lot of team effort in shooting guns. And as these people are doing here, everybody has a designated role. Everybody needs to perform. So that's another example of teamwork. There's, of course, more common things like these people right here, putting together engines. You might think of that as teamwork as well. Everybody doing their bit on the assembly line. And then, of course, there's this kind of teamwork. And here is pictured the great nation of Belgium, national ice hockey team. Of course, one of the leading nations in this field, as you might know. That's a joke. We are truly bad at this. We barely have any icing rinks. We don't play this sport. Anyway, what is then the idea of this paper? Well, you might also remember this guy. That's the COVID-19 virus, and again, James, you wrote a book on this more or less, but this has had some impact, this thing. And one of the things that I think is very relevant to firms is that it has pushed up absenteeism a lot for reasons that people are sick, but also quarantining, not being able to join work, having to be replaced, and so on and so forth. So work absenteeism is a thing now. And if it's a major problem, or if it's very common in the economy, we might wonder, what is the effect of absenteeism on workers? And then in this case, we're going to look at what's the effect on the workers that are not sick. So what happens to the other workers in the team when one person is absent and needs to be replaced? And of course, as you might have guessed, a good setting to do that is actually sports, because in sports, this happens quite a lot. And even before COVID, people were regularly replaced because they were unable to work through injury or sickness. So what's going to be the setting here is going to be ice hockey. And here starts my attempts at explaining ice hockey to you. So what is ice hockey? It's a game played on ice by two teams, and a team consists of one goalie, two defense players, and three offense players. And here's a chart, and so here's blue is going to play red. And in our setting in the National Hockey League, a team game roster actually has more than these players because there's a lot of rotation of players from the bench to the ice and back. So the team game roster typically has 20 players, 2 goalies, of which one plays and the other one basically sits on the bench. Then 2 defensemen that get replaced in sort of shifts by 4 others, and then these 3 at the front. They also typically have 3 sets of spares, so basically 12 offense men, which can then rotate from the ice to the bench and back as the coach instigates. Our analysis is going to focus on the 3 at the front. So we are concerned here with the offense team performance. Why is that? Because we want to use goals scored as a measure of their performance, which makes a lot of sense for them because that's their main job. So what are we going to do? We're going to answer the research question: how are offense players affected when their co-workers are absent and therefore replaced? So we're going to look at 3 things. First thing is output, so how many goals are scored by the offense. We're going to look at their working time, so how many minutes are they on the ice versus on the bench. And we're going to look at their productivity, and the productivity we're going to express as the number of goals someone scores per 15 minutes on the ice. And here's a picture of a hockey player scoring a goal. So the idea is that you put the puck, in the net behind the goalie. I'm told by Sam this is sort of a famous person. So there you go. So what is going to be the setup of this analysis? We're going to do we want to make a distinction here between 2 types of absences. And so the first sort of player that could be absent is a substitute worker to the offense. That means it's another offense player. So in principle, if you are 2 offense players, you could sort of do the same job, you might say, and you might consider working more to I knew Gretzky too. That was a joke. But anyway, this is because of the chat. So sorry about that. So suppose that you are that the one that is absent is an offense player, then we're going to call that a substitute worker absence, where the worker basically has the same job as you as a co-worker. Of course, there's also the option that a defense player is absent and replaced. In that case, we're going to call that a complementary worker absence, because it's very rare for offense players to take on defense positions. We have 6 players in our data set of 10 years that played in both roles. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at the period around an injury happening. And so I've made this PowerPoint graphic here to explain to you how that works. So we have a pre-period of 5 games. So game -5 to -1. And this is going to be our reference period. So this is when the team is supposedly in its normal shape. And then at game 0, we see this poor emoticon getting injured or getting sick, being unable to play in the future, and so has to be replaced. And then the post period is another 5 games in which this player is absent. Now, suppose that the player returns sooner, then we're going to cut this period short. So we're going to only look at the games where they are actually absent, bar that their absence is longer than 5 games, then we cut at 5 games. Now, that leaves us with another set of differences to make. And one thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna make a distinction between the co-workers of the injured player. And the first type is a regular player. And by regular, we're gonna mean a player that plays in all of these games. So that plays in -5, -4, -3, -2, -1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And is not the absent player, therefore. So this is a person that's actually basically always selected in the team. And in that sense is clearly the most natural person to look at for being affected by this absence, because this is the sort of the best comparable before and after. Then the second category is the occasional player, and this guy is sometimes in the lineup before and sometimes in the lineup after, but not always. So that means he's definitely in the lineup before the injury occurs, doesn't always have to be in the lineup after the injury occurs. And this might be important. So these are the sort of the fringe players that get selected now and then, but not always. And then there's the absent versus replacement. And this is the person that's getting injured in game 0. And then the replacement is a player that appears in games 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but did not appear before. So that was not in the selection, not in the lineup pre-period, but does appear post-period. Okay, so what do we think about this setting? Why is it a good setting, and why is it maybe not a good setting? So we think that the NHL has special features, and that's going to be 3 that distinguish it from a normal working place. And the first one is that it has a fixed total working time. And that's because a game is 20 minutes times 3, and you field 3 offense players. So basically the number of slots to play in, the working time to be allocated across your offense players, if you like, is 180 minutes per game. And so if you think about that, where do you see that also? We would argue that you see that also in the examples that I've given you, namely production facilities where you have full continuous shifts, where they basically produce 24/7. So think of chemical plants, for example, where an airline that flies from place A to place B, you need 2 pilots. These 2 pilots work for the duration of the flight. They don't have any option to work a little bit less or a little bit more together. So that's a special feature. Second special feature is that the team size is basically fixed. So there's no occasions where our absentee will not be replaced. So on the other hand, you also don't have the option to increase the size of the team, which is in a sense, on the one hand, you might say this is a lower bound for what an absentee causes in terms of production loss, because if you think about it, if you can always replace an absentee, in many cases, in many firms, that would not be the case. So you might have more production loss. On the other hand, if you have the option to replace someone by 2 people or by 3 people, then you might actually recoup more of the production loss. So that's also not possible here. And again, we would argue that our airline pilots are quite like this, because in a cockpit there's 3 seats or 2 seats, and there's no third seat for anyone to sit in. So they can't increase the team size at will either. And then a third feature, which we think is important from a endogeneity perspective, is that absence is common and involuntary. So in ice hockey, the workers are very closely monitored for their health. So it's not the case that you can shirk your way into an injury, probably. Also, that's probably not interesting to you because, as Francesco Principe and others have shown, having injuries in sports leads to long-term wage losses. So it's probably not something most players are willing to do, even if they can get some sort of sick pay. So as I already alluded to, there are, we think, some other settings which have these features, but clearly also quite a few settings that don't. And so that matters for the external validity. Okay, so that's what the setting looks like. And the good news is I made it through my ice hockey know-how part without an explosion of questions or comments, which is nice. So what are we going to use? We bought data from a website called Man Games Lost, And we paired that with data from NHL.com. Basically, Man Games Lost is an archive of injury data for American sports. We then did some cleaning. So the first thing we did is we exclude the game that the injury occurs. So if you go back to my beautiful timeline, game 0 is not in the data. And so if someone gets injured during a game, then the game is not considered here. Because that's obviously a game where you might play with a person less and not with a replacement. So that goes out. Then we remove all incomplete or unusual rosters, by which we mean instances where there were an other number of defense and offense players selected in the lineup than the typical amount of shifts that you would see. Then we remove these players that have played offense and defense in their career, and those are 6 players altogether in the whole data. That leaves us with 4,783 injuries in the data, which are 3,028 substitute workers, so basically other offense men, and 1,755 complementary or defense injuries. This affects 1,262 individual offense co-workers. So basically, these are the teammates of the injured people. And so that's and this is at the individual level. So 1,262 individual co-workers. And this is Wout van Aert, who won the green jersey in the Tour de France. And this was my way out. If I would have stumbled on the ice hockey, we could have talked about him for the rest of the talk. But since we've been making it so far, we're going to continue on ice hockey, I guess. So here's what the data then looks like. So the first panel is for substitute worker absences. So these are injuries of offense players. And so the regular workers, on average, we have 8.4 of them in a team. So that means around an injury, there's 8.4 players that play continuously in the 5 games before and after. And so that's obviously the same post-injury because we select on that. And so these 8.4 people are always there in the first 5 and in the second 5. What you see immediately is that their output of 0.22 goals per game does not change post-injury to pre-injury. Their working time, however, does change and it does go up. So they play more minutes. So they're on the bench less and on the ice more. Their productivity does take a hit. So they score less per time worked, which makes sense because they score the same and they work more. Then if you take a look at this absent replacement worker, so here the absent player is always one player is injured, but he can be replaced by more than one individual sometimes. So sometimes more than one new player appears that didn't play in the previous 5 games, and both of them we will dub replacement players. They were on average quite okay. So they were selected in the lineup 91% of the time. So that's almost always. Their output is slightly below the regulars, but that of the replacement is clearly below that of the injured players. And so this makes sense. The replacements also play less than the injured players. Their productivity is also lower. So this is because you replace an injured player on average by a worse replacement. And then there's the curious case of these occasionals. So what's to observe here? There are about 4 of them. And after the injury, there's less of them. So this means that some of them actually get dropped from the team. And that will also have implications because these that survive are on average making a little bit more output and being a little bit more productive. So that could be also a selection effect. And so one option is here that these are actually injured players that return, that are not the focal injured player, but for example, return from a long-term injury. All right. Then the complementary worker. So what happens when a defenseman is absent? Again, we have our worker pool of regular players. 8.8 players are always there. Here, their output does go down a little bit. Their working time more or less stays the same, and their productivity also takes a little hit. So this is in the summary stats already a little bit of story that we're going to see. If you take a look at the occasional workers again, these are not showing a lot of movement in this section here. So what are we going to do in terms of analysis? Something we think is fairly intuitive. What we're interested in is the output or the working time or the productivity of a worker, dubbed I, related to an injury M in a game T. And the only thing we're going to use is the post MT. So is it after or before the injury occurs? What are we going to add to this? A set of injury worker fixed effects. So basically, the worker is going to be compared to in his last 5 games to his first 5 games. And we're going to basically put a fixed effect for every worker injury at the worker injury level. So basically, we're going to narrow it down quite substantially. We will also replace these by simple injury fixed effects, because for the replacement and the injured worker, we cannot do this obviously because those people are not around post the injury. And the same is true for some of the occasional workers. So there we'll also see that that can make a difference. So when we estimate this, this is what we see. So in terms of all the workers, or in terms of the regular workers, the output effects are actually, so these are standard errors in the normal clustered way. We didn't put stars because that's out of vogue these days, apparently at the AEA. So what we did here is output sees no significant effect. So if you have injury worker fixed effects, the people that are playing all the time before and after, they see no decrease in their output when there's a replacement coming in. What they do get is a pretty big productivity hit. So they are producing less per time, but they make up for that by playing more. So basically, if someone that does the same job as you is absent and replaced by someone worse, what you do is you work more. So even though you make less per working time, you still actually make the same in the end. That seems to be the story of the co-workers with substitute injuries. For these occasionals, the story is a little bit more murky, and as you can see, this is an insignificant estimate as well. This is an insignificant estimate. They do get more working time as well. So that's the only significant thing that we find here. It makes a difference for them, though, that we include injury worker or injury fixed effects, because in these injury worker effects, only the occasional workers that are there before and after are taken into account. Whereas for the injury fixed effects, also the people that are only there before are taken into account. And that's why we get here this positive effect, which we think is a selection effect. This actually comes from the people that are not there after the injury, so that get dropped from the team, that are on average worse. So that explains the difference between these two coefficients. Of course, the big action is on the absent versus replacement worker. Here you see they make a lot less output because they're a lot less productive, and they also get to play a lot less time. And so this is clearly the big driver of the effect here. What happens when we look at these defense injuries? So here a defenseman is out. So that must mean the offense people, basically, they don't get more working time in total because there's none of them out. And so they you can't work more as an offense player because there's no position for you to work into. So that's also what we see with these regular players. They work a little bit more, but this is completely insignificant result. However, they do get a productivity hit. So strangely, or if you think about it after the fact, we thought intuitively, it's actually for your output as an offense worker, it's actually worse that a defenseman gets injured, because then the option of compensating by increasing your own working time is not there. And so in that sense, at the first time we saw this coefficient, believe me, we were surprised, because we thought if we should find an effect, it should be on the offense injuries, but in fact, it's on the defense injuries that we find an output effect. So this is what happens to the regular coworkers that get a complementary absence. For the occasionals, again, we don't find a lot of significant results with the injury worker fixed effects. If we do just injury effects, we find sort of the same effects that we had before. Again, we think this is purely selection, because the injury worker fixed effect shows it's not a within player effect, it's actually a between player effect that's at play here. All right, now next question is, of course, how does this aggregate to the whole team? And so there's one thing to say, this is the effect on the co-workers, but of course, how are all the co-workers together? How important is all of this for the team? And so this goes, and I saw that James and Benedict have this in their paper, and Kai have a little bit of this as well, when the returning COVID patient is affecting his co-workers when he returns. So here what we're going to do is we're going to sum the output of the players over groups. And so the group G can either be all the regular players, all the occasional players, or all the absent and injured, absent and replacement players, or it can be the whole team. And the rest of the analysis is basically the same, except that we have to replace, of course, our injury worker effect by a team, so by an injury fixed effect, which is the same as a team injury fixed effect, because there's only one injury per team. So what's important to note here is that we use summed up variables. And so for regular workers, you get a sum over 8. For occasional workers, a sum over 4, and for injured and replaced, a sum over 1. And so that makes it all the more surprising to some extent, you might say. So when you have this substitute worker injury, we do see an output effect. Where is this coming from? Here. This one player is causing an effect that's 10 times larger than these 8 players combined. And so the whole team effect is largely driven for substitute worker injuries by the fact that the replacement is just worse, making less output than the person that he's replacing. Even though, and here again, if you take a look at what the standard error and coefficient is like, here also the regular workers, actually, they don't produce significantly less output, but again, they work significantly more. So they actually, and so these sum up to this one. If you take a look at how this works, these players actually take over a lot of the work, more than the working time that this player plays less than the person he's replacing. Again, with occasional players, we don't find a lot of output effect significant, but here again, this selection story, they play as a group less after the injury, which we attribute to the worst ones being dropped out of the team in this group. But where does the output effect come from in all workers? Predominantly from this replacement here, not so much from everybody else. Definitely not from the people that are in the team all the time. Then is the complementary worker injury. And here the output effect is not significantly negative. But if you take a look at the effect of what all the regular workers are doing together, it is significantly negative. Again, they don't really have the option to work a lot more, so we don't find significant results on their working time here. Okay, so that's the story, and this is sort of a short paper. deliberately short, and now I'm going to show you stuff that's not in the paper that we did regardless. So this is the online appendix that we're roaming into now. The first robustness check here. You might say, Thomas, I believe you, but you know, I have a hard time believing people. So one thing that you did is you chose 5 games so that your story matches up. So that's a fair criticism. So what we did is we also took a look at -1 + 1, -2 + 2, -3 + 3, -4 + 4, and then -5 + 5. And so the thing to note is that, again, there's regular, injured, first replacement, and occasional players in all of these categories. Obviously, the number of observations runs up as you go through. The thing to note is that it becomes harder and harder to be a regular player the more games we include. So that's why this 27,000 is not exactly multiplied by 5 to get here. And so some people are regular when you just look at 1 game before, after, or 2, but they're not regular if you take a look at all 5, because that's when things get more complicated to be all the time selected. So what we do is we repeat our analysis on the regular workers for this -3, -4, -5. And so this is the original result. And so we find no output effect for the substitute workers in the original case. We find it for -4 + 4. We find it for -3 + 3, even though coefficient goes up, it stays insignificant here. Productivity takes a hit in all cases, and working time goes up in all cases. And if we do it for complementary workers, the story was output takes a hit, productivity takes a hit, working time does not change. Is the same for -4 + 4, is the same for -3 + 3. Then I have -1 + 1, -2 + 2. Story is repeated again. Here, productivity does not take a significant hit anymore. We think we just run out of data points really to estimate such a small effect. But working time keeps going up. So this seems to be a very, very robust result. If you take a look at complementary workers for this case, again, output effects stay significant, productivity effects stay significant, and working time effect basically stays 0. So that's sort of a good robustness check for our story. There's also one that we did where you might say, look, Thomas, this is fine, but you have all of these confounding factors, namely there's a lot of injuries, so people come back, go out, come back, go out. So what Sam did, to his credit, is clean the data such that we only have clean periods of 5 games where there's no other injury that occurs in the team, in any of the defensemen, in any of the offensemen. But you can imagine that in the NHL, this is quite a hard sell, because there's not that many periods of 10 games with just 1 injury and nobody else missing even 1 game. So this decreases the number of observations by an enormous amount. But still, if we then repeat what we did, we still find productivity to take a loss from these substitute injuries and working time to go up. Only now we see a negative output effect that's borderline significant. Our occasional player results become completely insignificant. You can imagine why, because we just don't keep a lot of people in this category. So that's the case. Our absent versus replacement result, as you can see, is still a big coefficient. So that still is the main effect in this robustness check. We think we're lacking power here to do a lot. So that's why we didn't make this the main specification. So what to conclude from all of this? Regular coworkers, we argue, they get a lower productivity when they have to play with a replacement instead of their regular coworker. The substitute, on the other hand, If this is a substitute worker, so if the worker has the same job as you can increase your working time. If this player has a different job than you, there's no increase in working time. So you cannot compensate your output loss. And in most of our specifications, what we find is that the output loss in the substitute case turns out to be insignificant per coworker. In the complementary case, it turns out to be significant in almost all of our specifications. At the team level, there's a big selection effect in these occasional workers. And the main channel for output loss at the team level, we would argue, is actually the fact that you have to place a replacement instead of an absent worker. That's where you lose most of your output, not so much in the coworker effects. But of course, there is a big literature on peer effects, and that's what we want to tie this into. So I'm going to do a little bit of reverse. Now I'm going to talk about how this relates to the literature. So in the absenteeism literature, if there is such a thing, we found a couple of high stakes papers that look at non-sports settings. One looks at interim teachers, finds lower student performance when there's so this would be the direct effect of having a replacement. And then there's another paper in the AJ applied that looks at nursing team disruptions, and basically there they argue you get lower coworker productivity if you have to fit in someone new. So that sort of relates to our indirect effect. So this is sort of the coworker effect, and this is the absent versus replacement. We would say we contribute in a way by connecting these two. We can have the direct effect and we have the indirect effect. The direct effect of having a worse replacement than the absent person, an indirect effect on all the co-workers, which we show is in the aggregate not that important, we would argue, but is still significant. So there is some peer effect going on. And then there's, of course, people doing this in sports. And so here we go. I think the most related paper, very recent working paper, been sent a more recent version even this week by Benedict, is of course James's paper with Kai and Benedict that says that people that have had COVID have lower performance both as a player and as a team after they come back and are quote unquote recovered. I think our paper looks at the actual period of absence. So that's a difference, a different kind of perspective. Our paper is purely also on the performance of the other people, you might say, not on the people that return. There's some literature that looks at injuries and how it penalizes players' careers. There's Francesco's paper with Vincenzo and Alex Jones, I believe. Then there's Ian's paper on using injuries to estimate marginal revenue product of the players, which I think is pretty neat. And then there's another paper in the Academy of Management journal, which I can't say that I completely understood what the theory part was saying, but the analysis is sort of looking at networks. So basically saying if a player is more central, replacing him is more difficult, which seems very intuitive as well. Where do we want to talk a little bit more about is what is the mechanism behind this productivity loss? So why do coworkers become less productive when they have to play with someone new? So there's, I think, three big candidates. The first one is obviously peer effects. So if you play with someone better, you're just better. So there doesn't need to be learning or anything going on. If I write a paper with Jan van Oers, I just am a better paper writer because Jan van Oers is a better paper writer than me, period. Right? So that's the story then. You could also say people have experience together and that can matter. Sam's previous work on the NHL, where he tried to identify this, suggests that this is not so important in terms of people train a lot together, which seems to be quite important, but playing together seems to be not that additionally important, but on top of all the training you do together. And then of course you work more, so you might be fatigued. because in the NHL, I'm told also by Sam, who is a player, that it's very tiring to play ice hockey. So even these additional quarter minutes per game might actually make you play just those 10 seconds too long, because a shift on the ice is very short. And you can see these guys, they're really, very tired from playing. On the other hand, what we do find is that this effect of productivity loss is also there for the complementary absence when you do not play more. And that suggests to us strongly that this is actually a perfect story. Because why would you have fatigue in the case of the complementary absence where you do not play more time? So in that sense, we are tended to interpret our results mainly as perfect results. What you could definitely say about the complementary injury results, because there is no additional working time there. So final point I want to talk about is external validity. And of course, in this context here of the ROSES seminar, people are happy about sports papers, and that's great. I'm also happy about sports papers, but in the interest of publishing, it's always good to think about this question. And so the first thing I want to say is, of course, teamwork is pervasive, but it has special features in this case. And the first one is that the team size is fixed. You're always replaced. On the other hand, you cannot compensate by having a bigger team. So these two things might run counter to each other. On the one hand, we underestimate the true productivity loss because in many firms there will be no replacement. On the other hand, an actual firm might choose to have more than one replacement or to shake up the team in other ways that are not possible for an NHL team. So we think that the overall effect in that sense of having team size fixed versus context where this is not the case is a topic for further research, really. And the final thing we want to add to that is that a fixed team size is not that uncommon. That there's actually quite a few settings you can think about where the technology of production makes the team size fixed. And of course, in the large economy, you might say the assembly line is the most important one. There's just so many stations in an assembly line, and it's not possible to keep one unmanned in production. It's also not possible to put two people in one station. So it's in chemical production and in assembly line production quite um, quite likely, I would say, that you have a situation, if you look at shifts, team shifts, that are actually not very different from what we see here. We had these two airline pilots already. I think it's very comparable to what we have here. You're very interdependent. You're clearly by technology limited to the number of seats that's in your cockpit. And these people shooting the howitzer, they've basically face the exact same kind of production limits. And then, of course, there's the other external validity of Wout van Aert, who is also racing with a fixed team size, even though I would say for the cycling enthusiasts, an interesting feature of cycling is, of course, that during the Tour de France, the team sizes shrink at different rates in terms of the injuries that are occurred during the race. So this might be a nice topic for further analysis when we want to relax some of these stringent assumptions. Okay, so short paper, short presentation, I think, James. So all I have left is to thank you for turning up during the holiday on what's a good weather day, probably in most places. So any questions?
Great. Thank you very much, Thomas, stepping up at short notice and a really interesting presentation. Alex has already got his hand up, so Alex, go ahead.
I would expect nothing else. Alex, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas. That was very nice. You are an ice hockey expert. Just as I am a ski jumping expert, right? Anyway, so I have some questions. I'm not sure that you can tell me maybe. Is the injury a random event in terms of when did it occur, in a home game, in an away game, in the series of the away games?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so at now, what we've done is we've taken all injuries, but we actually know the cause of the injury as well. So in the past, what we've been doing is we've been trying to distinguish between the more and the less exogenous injuries. This is well, a matter of taste, I would say. But the story does not depend, it's not checks that I've shown, but in the past, we could have thrown out certain types of injuries that you might say are sort of endogenously caused by the performance of the player or by the performance of the team. So we need some guidance probably on this. So what we've been thinking about is, for example, strained muscles being more of a fatigue sort of overplayed injury than getting a puck to the head or being beaten up by, well, maybe that's also endogenous, I don't know. But clearly the flu, which is also quite common as an injury in ice hockey, is exogenous to the game. And so in that sense, we can make some difference there. I didn't show you these results because we didn't put them in the paper in the end, but I take your comment, and I think you're right.
Because I would guess that, and it's just a guess. I'm not a big expert in ice hockey as well, but I would guess that in long, long away series games, there might be a different probability of being injured than in home games. And I'm not sure in which direction, to be honest. But
well, we'd have to ask Sam about this, and I'm not sure he's in here. My recollection is that we didn't find a lot of pattern in these injuries.
Okay.
But we can definitely. So it's definitely on the list of things that we expect to be doing still. Specifically, if there's a pattern in these sort of types of injuries. The problem with the man games lost data is that type of injury is very wordly described. So it's you have to group all the strained left calf injuries with the strained left triceps or whatever.
But I'm more concerned with whether these are home or away games, because if there are more away games, then the story is much more simple home advantage. That's it.
Yeah. So you would say, is it the case that you're just playing more away
Yes,
or more home
exactly.
after?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, that's an easy check. We can do that.
Yeah. And then maybe some heterogeneity tests that you could do, because there are 4 different lines, right, in each team. And then
yes.
the injury from the first line might be different than the injury in the fourth line, right?
Yeah, we did.
But I would guess that the injury in the first line is more likely because they play more, probably.
Yes. What we did is we looked at the types of injury by salary level in the team, by line. We find typically that there's not a lot of heterogeneity, but what does matter is that if someone is at the bottom of the pyramid, let's say in terms of salary or in terms of playing time, they disrupt less simply because they weren't contributing as much before, obviously, then so they don't change the working time of the others as much as when somebody in the first line gets injured, then the working time of everybody else goes up more because so this person was doing a lot of playing time, so you have a lot of room to compensate into. Whereas if also run in the fourth line gets injured, that doesn't lead everybody else to have to play more time, if you see what I mean. So we did these sort of heterogeneity analysis. We didn't think that there were a lot of stories coming out of there that were not sort of very obvious. So we kept them for now out of the paper, but if we go for a longer manuscript, we can definitely dig them back up. I think what we would be very concerned about is indeed if there's an effect of the likeliness of having an injury, and so that's what we want to be very careful about.
Great.
Thanks for the questions. Great questions.
Thanks, Alex. Dennis.
Thanks, Thomas. This is quite an interesting paper. I have a couple of questions that may press you too much on your knowledge of hockey, so I apologize for that.
It's okay.
And partially it comes back to one of the questions that Alex asked about the lines. So suppose that a player on the first line gets injured. How is that injured player replaced? By moving the person from the second line into his spot or bringing some other player from elsewhere? And so the question becomes, how many of these lines do you disrupt in the process? And it seems to me that the more of the lines you disrupt, the bigger the impact is going to be. And so some control for that, I think, would be really important. The second question that I have is related to a paper that I did on handedness in hockey. And where a player plays depends upon whether they shoot left or right-handed, and some players are on the opposite side, and it seems to be important. And in particular, what we find is that people playing on one side get paid more for scoring a goal than if they were the same player and played on the opposite side of the ice. And so I wonder about the replacement player. How do they compare to the player they're replacing in not just their ability attributes, but sort of the other attributes, like are they left-handed or right-handed, that sort of thing. And then the final issue that I want to raise with you is you talked about being surprised about the effect from the defenseman being out and how big it was. And I didn't find that surprising at all. And the reason I didn't find it surprising at all is because, except for on breakaway kind of situations, if you have the set offense, the defensemen are key. They're at the blue line and making many of the passes. And so if you take one of those key players out of that rotation, that seems like it would, I mean, take the person who is the best assist maker on your basketball team out, and that clearly is going to influence how much you score, it seems to me. Similarly, take the best player on your soccer team of clearing the ball and starting the breakaway off of your team, even though they are not an offensive player, they could have a big impact. And it seems to me that that's what your defense missing is finding. So I look forward to your responses.
Yeah, let me take the last one first. Very good comments, Dennis. Thanks for that. So indeed, I guess I was more surprised. So maybe I misphrased a little bit. So I thought if we're going to find an effect, it's going to be in offense. But this was indeed as a naive person. Another thing that Sam pointed out on this is that because of the shift system, as a defenseman, you actually play with all of the offense usually. Whereas as an offense, you play with two other offensemen. So you sort of affect all of the offense if you're a defense player, whereas as an offense player, you basically affect two people. So this is, I think, another sort of reason why it should actually be obvious that what we find makes sense. Indeed, as you said, they are key to the playmaking, and they play with all of the offense in a game, right? So intermittently, but with everybody at some point. So that's a point well taken, and I think it says more about my initial complete not knowing hockey that I was so surprised by this. The handedness is, I think, a very good comment. We haven't really taken that in. So we, at the moment, I think we can probably dig that out from various sources. So it's something we can definitely do. And it would seem interesting to see, for example, at maybe it's also harder to replace a left-handed player because there's less left-handed players in your selection typically, I would assume. So that would definitely be something that that we could add to this. The injury by line, what we've been doing on this front is Sam has been occupied quite some time by trying to establish the empirical lines. So basically looking at who is the peer to whom, and so looking at what is your next, who do you play with most, next most, and then the drop off typically comes for offense to the third most, fourth most, and so on. We in the end did not use a lot of that information in what we wrote down in this paper. We did have a heterogeneity by the line of the injury result in one of our previous versions, and looking at the comments I'm getting here, probably it would be a good idea to bring that back at some point, because indeed, as you said, if it's a first line injury, obviously you disrupt more of the structure of the team, and vis-a-vis you also find larger effects. So that's what we did find. We did not bring that in here because it was, yeah, we're trying to keep this below 5,000 words. But the point is well taken, and maybe it belongs in there anyway. It's the final thing we scrapped before we got to the 5,000 line, but maybe the thing too much. So thank you for that.
Great, thanks, Dennis. Any more questions and comments for Thomas? One very minor point is, I think one of the Robbie Butler, I think, presented it because Robbie Butler with Rob Simmons, David Butler, and Alex Farnell have got another paper on the COVID effect on player productivity as well, similar to the paper that I have with Kai and Benedict.
Do you have a version of that by accident?
I think they presented it possibly at the Western Football Finance Conference, possibly, I can't remember, but worth checking that out.
Yeah, thank you.
Here, I think he might know, maybe. Do you want to put him on the spot though?
All right, very good, thank you.
Any other questions and comments? Well, it is, as you said, Thomas, a good weather day here. I imagine so in Netherlands or Belgium as well. Maybe even in Norway as well for Alex. So it's probably a good point to finish. So thank you once again for stepping in at short notice. A really interesting presentation. And we shall return next week when we have, I've not got the information down on the title, but we've got Mobilaji Alabi, who's a PhD student here at the University of Reading in the Henley Business School, presenting on a financial case study of Chelsea and Manchester United. So do join us next Friday. And in the meantime, wish you a fantastic weekend. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, everyone.